Whether salinity intrusion in Bangladesh is making it difficult for farmers to continue cultivating rice, or flooding in Kenya is killing livestock and destroying crops, people's livelihoods are being threatened by climate change. In many cases, people have to adapt to these stresses by migrating. By 2050, 143 million climate migrants will face an existential threat and be displaced, the World Bank said in a new report. That includes 86 million in sub-Saharan Africa, 40 million in South Asia, and 17 million in Latin America.
The effects of climate change will create conditions that will compel people to move, or that will make them move voluntarily as a way to adapt to these changes through different channels. Typically, we shall distinguish three regions of the world that are particularly affected by these migration movements, which are Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and the small island states and territories, particularly in the South Pacific Ocean and in the Indian Ocean.
95% of the displacement has occurred in developing countries, and 99% of all deaths from weather-related disasters have occurred in developing countries. In that, for the wealthy and the developed world, climate change and climate migrants are still almost an abstract concept. But for many people living in the most vulnerable geographies, in the most vulnerable nations, it is a reality that is affecting their lives or has already devastated their lives.
Disasters today represent a leading driver of displacement worldwide. It's estimated that every year disasters push about 25 million people on the road, meaning that disasters today displace more people than war and conflict, for example.
However, climate migrants are not legally considered refugees, according to the international refugee laws. Some experts claim that most migrants now are internally displaced, so adding climate refugees to international law might not be the best practice to provide protection for existing refugees. Environmental campaigners warned that vulnerable communities uprooted by climate change are being left out of global talks on migration. Many critics said international human rights and refugee law fail to adequately protect people displaced across borders.
Most of the migration flows related to environmental changes are internal migration flows, which means that the international migration is the exception rather than the rule, for the moment at least, which means that a solution stemming from international law would only apply to a small minority of the people affected by these changes.
The real gap here is not so much legal protection, it's not a legal gap, it's an implementation at the national level. And countries need support and capacity building to ensure that they are able to protect populations in these contexts. However, as you've rightly mentioned, there are certainly some people who do flee across international borders in search of assistance and protection, and in fact, these numbers are growing. Sometimes they may in fact be eligible for refugee status. This is under the conventional definition of who is a refugee. So, for example, if a government withholds humanitarian assistance in the aftermath of a disaster, or if they sideline the recovery needs of a specific marginalized population, this may in fact lead to persecution that's akin to one of the 1951 Refugee Convention grounds.
For the best part of a decade, we've seen on average around 21 million people who have been forced to move as a result of weather-related events. That's 59,600 people every day. Now, are those people being forced across national boundaries and across national borders? Primarily, at this moment in time, not. But they will be in the future. This is the critical issue that people still seem to be unwilling to address.
There are legal protection gaps. For populations who don't necessarily meet the definition of a refugee, there is little scope to expand that definition to make sure that they are covered. And this is sort of the birthplace for something called the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. So in 2011, I'll give you a brief summary, it was clear that the issue of climate change and disaster displacement across borders was so important and that it needed to be addressed outside of the UN system. So Switzerland and Norway launched at one of UNHCR's executive committee meetings a process, a series of regional consultations to go to the hotspots of the world, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central America, the Pacific, the places where climate change impacts are already so apparent, and look at what governments and civil society actors see as the protection needs for people who are displaced across borders.
The Platform on Disaster Displacement, launched in 2016 by a coalition of national governments, will encourage countries to assist these migrants despite the lack of legal recognition of their plight. Nevertheless, a wealth of practices whose scale and scope is questioned by campaigners.
That we don't believe the current system is any way adequate to deal with the scope and scale of the problem that we are going to witness in the coming years. Very particularly, we want to see an entirely new legal framework developed to deal with climate refugees and environmental refugees, if you like. Right now, if somebody is forced to leave their home as a result of an extreme weather event, it's unclear who, why, where, what would support them, where would be the basis. But worse still, if they are forced to move across national boundaries, what rights and protections do they have? Who is charged with looking after them and supporting them? Where can they go? How can they be settled? All of these questions have to be answered, and it is no longer acceptable simply to just try and wish them away or close our eyes and hope for a different tomorrow.
Besides, political wills from governments around the world to tackle this issue vary. New Zealand is proposing a special climate humanitarian visa for Pacific Islanders who are forced to migrate. US President Donald Trump ended America's participation in the Global Compact on Migration and the Paris Agreement.
I think both at a regional, nationally, regionally and globally, it's very weak. I think politicians are running scared of this issue. And I understand why. I'm sensitive to this. The idea that perhaps a new legal framework would allow hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe tens of millions of people into different areas and territories where they have not been before comes with all sorts of problems and risks. The obvious economic costs is one, but there are cultural and social issues that arise from the collision of different cultures, of different religions, of different peoples who have not historically perhaps mixed.
I think that many still consider it as an environmental issue. And when we say that, I mean as a technical issue that would need to be addressed through very technical policies, and that it is a kind of field of expert. And I think that many governments do not realize yet that climate change will affect all the key major society challenges of the 21st century: migration, security, development, public health. All of these challenges that are at the very core of public policies in most countries of the world will be affected.
There's also challenges around political will. And these are ongoing. And I think, as you're aware, there's a real risk to undermining protection for people who do meet refugee status according to the 1951 Convention and regional conventions.
Quite a lot of governments consider the Paris Agreement as a finish line, consider that they've done their job with the Paris Agreement and that they can tick the box climate change on their to-do list and move on to the next issue. And that a lot of governments are considering that it is now up to the civil society to implement the Paris Agreement, and that the action of government, in a way, is no longer really necessary, that there is a kind of momentum in society. I think this is a grave mistake.
We need to see regional action. So, for example, in the context of the European Union or maybe the ASEAN states, and we need to see global action through the auspices of the United Nations. But there is a key point here, and it's one of enlightened self-interest. No country will be able to deal with the impacts, the outcomes of climate change on its own. And that is most particularly witnessed when you look at forced mass migration. We have an interest in working together, in formulating a coherent, effective, humanitarian response to this problem.
I think, for example, that some solutions can be found bilaterally or regionally. Very often, when we consider migration related to climate change, we see it as a global issue, requiring a kind of global solution. The reality is that many of the solutions will be based locally, nationally, or regionally, and that it is possible to find mutually benefiting agreements that would actually make sure that migration is used as a strategy of adaptation. And I think that one of the challenge, policy-wise, when it's about migration related to climate change, is to make sure that as many people as possible have access to migration opportunities, also in order to adapt to the environmental disruption, to environmental degradation. And migration, if it is anticipated, if it is organized and discussed with the people, can be a very powerful adaptation strategy. If it is not organized, if it is not planified, then most likely migration will be a forced choice, leading to humanitarian situation, leading to drama and trauma.
I think there's a growing momentum. There is more attention to this issue now, certainly than there was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think there is an increasing awareness of the complexity of mobility drivers, the complexity of migration, the complexity of displacement, and an increasing consciousness of the need to think long term. I think a message that I have just across the board is that climate change and disaster displacement is fundamentally an issue of intergenerational equity. And if we're thinking about what the world will look like in 50 years and 100 years, preparing and developing the institutions and the frameworks and the funding mechanisms to address these challenges is an essential part of that picture.
We have commissioned legal experts, world-recognized legal experts, to draft a legal framework of what may be possible. So we want to present that to governments, to institutions. We will start by presenting it to the European Commission and European parliamentarians to work on this.